As I mentioned this morning, we're going to be in 1 Samuel 25 looking at David, Nabal, and Abigail. And as far as kind of stories about David go, this is kind of one of the more notable stories. And afterwards, mentioning what I would speak on tonight, I actually had a couple to say to me that that's one of their favorite stories or more memorable stories in the life of David. It's kind of interesting because, as you kind of come on the scene, it's the fact that David's men had been somewhat together with Nabal's men, his shepherds, etc. And then there would have been a custom of, at the shearing of the sheep, a great feast. And everybody that's had anything to do with kind of bringing these sheep to that point would have been invited. Well, and then Nabal shuns David and his men, as we will see. It's kind of outside of our realm of custom and understanding. And one thing I read that, and it's kind of, as I read it, I thought, well, that's kind of really pressing the point. It's kind of almost, I'm not sure that's a good illustration. But it gave the illustration of someone going to a restaurant and sitting down. And it's a full-service restaurant. And we all know that in the United States, not necessarily world over, but in our country, in a full-service restaurant, generally that waiter or waitress is paid somewhat of a minimal salary. And he or she is dependent upon their wages from the ones they are serving. And it's kind of like we sit down. It's like we're entering into an unwritten, even unspoken contract with that waiter or waitress to leave that tip. And then we refuse to pay the tip. Well, we violated, kind of that unwritten, unspoken contract. We violated the custom, and we've been out and out just rude. Well, kind of what went along with David's men and then Nabal. What he should have been, what David and his men should have been entitled to, see, Nabal refused. Well, I mentioned three people. David, Nabal, and then his wife Abigail. In 1 Samuel 25, you're going to see some things that kind of alert you to the kind of man that Nabal was and the kind of woman that Abigail was. Now, as far as David, I think you know David well enough. And kind of what you know about David, it's not so greatly enlightened just by this chapter. Well, what about Nabal? Well, in Nabal chapter 25, verse 3, it says, "Now the name of the man was Nabal, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite." Okay, being a Calebite, I don't think that's to explain his being harsh and badly behaved. But that's how he's explained in the narrative. Then you get down to 1 Samuel 25, verse 17. And by the way, it's interesting to see then who says this, and then later we're going to see in verse 25 another kind of, here's the man and who said that. Well, in verse 17, it was one of his servants that said this. "And he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him." Now, I thought this was interesting. A servant, his own servant, said, a worthless man, and no one can speak to him. And I looked up several translations on this, no one can speak to him, or one cannot speak to him. All basically say the same. But then I got to thinking, what is this? Nobody can speak to him. I have an idea today if somebody says, nobody can, and what we would say is nobody can tell him anything. And probably what we mean by that is he doesn't listen. And I think that's probably what's going on here. Is this servant has seen enough of the character of this man who's his master that he says he's worthless and one cannot speak to him. Well, then we see in verse 25 another kind of evaluation of the character of Nabal. But this time, it's his own wife speaking. Somebody might argue, well, how well does the servant know Nabal? How well does the wife know Nabal? I think we would assume very well. And then here's what she says. She's speaking to David. She says, "Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal." So just as the servant had called him worthless, now his wife calls him worthless. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. You see this word Nabal is folly or foolish. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Okay, so that's Nabal. Then we see Abigail. Now, there's not a lot said about Abigail as far as her character, but she's spoken of in verse 3, and it says, the name of his wife was Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful. Well, beautiful, I think that would speak of her external appearance, but discerning, her mind, her heart. She was a woman of understanding. I think you could say and go along with this, she was a woman of wisdom. You know, this was certainly a mismatched marriage in the sense of one man's considered worthless, but his wife discerning and beautiful. And then, of course, David. Okay, that's the characters. Now, what's going on? Well, there's conflicts. There's conflicts, you might say, between the husband and wife with regards to his temperament, attitude, and philosophy. And there was also, we could say, conflict between employer-employee. That's how you would consider, really, Nabal and then David and his men. And now we're going to see the request. Keep in mind now that David's men, and later on we'll see that there were 600 of them, but they had taken good care of Nabal's shepherds and sheep. And now it's time for the sheep shearing, and there's a great feast. Here's the request. This begins in verse 8. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him, peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have." So notice there's the proper greeting. Respect is shown. Then he says, "I hear that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." There's respect. There's even verification that could take place. You ask your servants and verify us and what we've done. And then there was the request. And according to custom in the day, it would have been a fair request. But then we find the refusal. In verses 10 and 11, Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David, and who is the son of Jesse?" You know, I know sometimes we may ask some questions of which we can't really find an answer. But with regards to what had been told to Nabal, we don't find the son of Jesse being a part of it. So when he says, "Who is David, who is the son of Jesse?" he's asking, but could it be that he really knew and understood? And it would seem that later on when Abigail is talking with David, she well understands that David's more than just an itinerant, if you would, soldier. He then goes on, there are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? He's refused to verify. David said to his servants, tell him, ask your servants. Doesn't do that apparently. Insults David. Well, there's a lot of runaway servants. You might just be the same. But he refuses. Well, then this word is brought back to David. And you know how sometimes things can just hit you? And maybe hit you wrong, or it maybe hit you right, but it's kind of almost a volcanic reaction that you have. Well, we find that this is almost similar to what happens with David. David hears this. And immediately, here's what you read. David said to his men, every man strap on his sword, and every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. So he's taken 400 of the 600 men that are with him. And all, they're ready for battle. They're ready for war. Now, sometimes people in reading this ask the question, well, wait. During David's being the refugee from Saul, twice he had good opportunity to kill Saul. And he refused to do it. But now he's apparently ready to kill Nabal and all of those with him. So why? What's the difference? Well, one question could it be that he had insulted and mistreated David's men, who had trusted David, had confidence in him, men that were loyal to David, even while he's being hunted by Saul, so he feels kind of forced to defend not only himself, but them too. Could it be that he had expended all of his patience with Saul, now he has none with Nabal? Could it be that he was just tired and hungry? These are some things people might bring up. Let me tell you what I wonder. There's no real answer to this. We don't have a definitive, thus saith the Lord. What I wonder, what was Saul's position? He was king. Who made him king? God did. And you find him more than once refusing to take up a sword against God's anointed. And so maybe there was this respect to the position that Saul had, so he was not going to kill Saul. Nabal, just a rude, worthless, unappreciative man who owed Saul and owed his men. So David's going to have his vengeance. Well, thankfully, Abigail learns what happened. You read verses 14 beginning. One of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were, remember, David said, ask your servants, verify. And here the servant says, yet the men were very good to us. We suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields. Now listen to this. As long as we went with them. It almost sounds like the servant is saying, we recognized the advantage to us, so we stuck with them. They were good to us. Verse 16, they were a wall to us, both by night and by day, all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this and consider what you should do, For harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. You know, this story has a very important servant right here, doesn't it? And an amazing wife, as she then responds wisely. Even though her husband is, by her own admission, worthless, Abigail protects him. Abigail sends supplies to David and then goes herself. She doesn't tell her husband at this point. And you know, when I read this, I can tell you what cannot help but come to my mind. Okay, remember now, he's the husband, she's the wife. Does God give instruction about husbands? The role of being a husband, his expectations of husbands? And do wives enter the marriage with those expectations? Now, that's a yes, of course. But then what happens? What happens when the man, the husband, refuses to fulfill God's role for the husband that his wife is aware of and knows and expected? What is she to do? Can you imagine and understand the difficulty? What happens in a congregation, for instance, if men were just to refuse to take on the role that God has given with regards to male leadership in the assembly? Many years ago, I was in college, so I could say ancient history. I preached every third Sunday for about 2.5 years at a very, very small church in Alabama. I think the lowest went through a period where we averaged about 9. Went through a period maybe where we averaged about 20, 22. There was only one man in the congregation who was a Christian. And he would wait on the table and he would lead a prayer. But that's all he would do. I mean, that is seriously, that's all he would do. A lady at that congregation had to call me up and say, our Bible study starts at, and she'd give me the text where I'm to start. It was a lady at that congregation that had to take whatever money was collected and put it in the bank, pay the utilities, pay the bills. You know, and somebody might say, well, is she doing more than she should be doing? I'm not even going to go to that debate because I'm just saying there was nobody else to do it. There was nobody else to do it. He refused. He was the only one he refused. Now later as time progressed, there were some young ladies who were attending and some of their husbands began to attend. And then eventually they became Christians. And so now there are some other men. And they began to take on some functions. And they began to think to themselves, well, maybe as a church we could do... Well, they went to 2 or 3 of these matriarch women and asked them, do you think we could... Let me tell you what she told them. This is what came to me. She says, you know, that is a wonderful idea. Why don't you men meet and talk about that? And I thought, how beautiful and how amazing for this subtle way that this older woman helped to bring these young men to a point of leadership. What happens when there's nobody there to do it? She found herself in this situation. Her husband didn't do it. She had to. Well, she goes to David, and let me just say this. When you read how she goes in a very humble fashion. 1 Samuel 25:23 says, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She's showing deference. Verses 24 and 25, it says, she fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Now, you know, I know, Abigail knew, David knew, she wasn't really the one that was guilty. She's willing to take it on if it meant saving her household. That almost reminds me of Jesus taking on our sins to save us. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. She's got his attention. And her appeal, as you continue to read about that, she has an appeal based on the Lord himself. She says, now then, my Lord. She's referring to him as Lord in deference as Master, but she says, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand. Now let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you as long as you live. So she makes an appeal. Part of that appeal is based upon God himself. And then part of the appeal is based upon consequences. You know, most actions do have some consequences. Maybe sometimes not, but so much of the time, yes. And she appeals to this. Verses 30 and 31. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel. See what she knows? God's appointed you prince over Israel. And how does Nabal not know this? My Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord taking vengeance himself. In other words, when that time comes that you become king, you don't have in the back of your mind and your heart the fact that you have then slaughtered this household today. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. And then we see that David responds humbly. David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from avenging myself with my own hand. How appreciative he is of Abigail, this discerning and beautiful woman. Now, as you continue to read the story and how it goes, well, she didn't initially tell her husband. And then she does. And it says, his heart died within him and became as a stone. And then 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. And then eventually, of course, Abigail married David. And that's that basic story of David and Nabal and Abigail. And there's a lot to be learned, isn't there? As you'd consider Nabal, the worthless man, Nobody could speak to him. And how he made choices that were selfish and only for himself, disregarding others. David, wronged, angry. And how do you deal with it? And then Abigail, with her husband being the worthless man that he was, how does she save her household? And how does she respond to David? A lot of lessons to be learned from all three of these main characters. As we close, would like to just say, I know this was an Old Testament story, David. We've been looking at some things in David's life for several weeks. But the more important thing as we close is, well, what about me and my God? What about me and Judgment Day that is impending? What about me and eternity that's real? Am I ready? What would I hear? Well done, thou good and faithful servant? Or depart from me? And I think everyone here knows and understands you don't want to hear depart from me. The horrible nature of what that means and the permanence of it should scare us greatly, making us want to obey our Lord, to be able to hear, well done, thou good and faithful servant. And God's been so good in His mercy and grace, even in spite of our sins, sending His Son to die, shed His blood, so that we could be saved. Now we need to respond in faith, repentance, to confess our faith, be baptized for the remission of sins. We could assist you in that tonight. We could assist you by praying for you if that is the need. If you need to come, please come.